The smell of burnt engine oil and cheap food had become so normal to Roan that he did not notice it anymore. He walked through the lower market of Caldera Station, the way a person walks through their own house in the dark, by memory, by habit, without really seeing anything. His boots were held together by a strip of bonding tape he had found in the repair bay. His jacket had a burn hole near the left pocket. He had exactly 4 credits to his name, and 3 of those were supposed to go toward the guild debt he owed for his late father's unpaid tools. He was not in the market to buy anything. He was cutting through it because it was faster than the outer corridor, and because the heat from the food stalls was warmer than the drafty maintenance tunnels he usually took back to his bunk. That was the only reason he was there. That was what he told himself later anyway. The stall that stopped him was tucked between a rack of second-hand pressure suits and a table piled with broken navigation parts. The alien running it was called Grell, a wide, slow-moving creature with dull green skin and 3 pairs of arms, 2 of which were currently stacking crates while the other 4 sorted through a box of junk. Grell sold odds and ends, broken things, things nobody else wanted. His stall smelled like dust and old metal. What stopped Roan was not the stall. It was the small creature sitting on top of a cracked data pad at the corner of Grell's table, being used to stop the pad from sliding off the edge. It was tiny, small enough to fit in a cupped hand with room to spare. It looked like someone had made a dragon out of leftover parts scales that shifted between blue and green and copper depending on the light, wings folded flat against its back like crumpled foil, a tail curled around the data pad to keep itself from falling. Its eyes were open. They were the color of amber, and they were looking directly at Roan. He stopped walking. The creature did not blink, neither did he. "What is that?" Roan asked. Grell glanced over with 2 of his eyes and made a sound somewhere between a grunt and a sigh. "Pocket Drake. Run of a clutch I took in payment for a debt. Useless thing. Too small to do anything, too stubborn to train. Was going to toss it with the scrap." "It's alive," Roan said. "Obviously." Roan looked at the creature. The creature kept looking at him. It had not moved at all, but something about the way it was watching him felt very deliberate, like it was paying close attention and making a decision. "How much?" Roan heard himself say. Grell named a price. Roan almost laughed. That was more than he had. He said so. Grell made the sound again, looked at the creature, then looked back at Roan and named a lower price. 1 credit. Roan opened his mouth to say he still only had 4 and he needed 3 of them, and then he closed it again, and then he handed over 1 credit. He was not entirely sure why. Grell wrapped the creature in a piece of cloth and passed it over. The moment Roan's hands closed around it, the creature made a sound not loud, barely more than a breath, and went completely still in a way that felt different from before. Not frozen, settled. Roan stood there for a moment, holding a tiny dragon in a scrap of cloth, in the middle of a station market. With 3 credits to his name and a guild debt he had no idea how to pay. He walked back to his bunk. His bunk was a narrow room at the far end of Corridor 7, where the heating unit worked about half the time, and the walls were close enough together that he could touch both with his elbows. There was a cot, a small shelf, a storage box under the bed, and a hook on the wall where he kept his jacket. That was everything. He set the cloth bundle down on the cot and opened it. The pocket Drake sat up immediately, as if it had been waiting. It looked around the room slowly, at the shelf, at the storage box, at the hook on the wall, and then it looked at Roan again. "I don't know what to do with you," Roan said honestly. The creature tilted its head about 3 degrees to the left. "I don't have food for you. I barely have food for me." He sat down on the cot beside it. "And I don't know what you eat." It took a small step toward him, then another. Then it climbed onto his knee, turned twice in a tight circle, and sat down as if that was simply where it lived now. Roan stared at it for a while. It stared back. The scales on its back shifted in the low light, blue to green to something almost gold along the edges. It really was very small. He could feel the warmth of it through his trousers, surprising for something so tiny, like a coal that had been burning quietly for a long time. "Pip," he said. He didn't plan it. It just came out. The creature's ears, two small ridges along the top of its head, lifted slightly. "I'm going to call you Pip." The warmth on his knee got a little stronger. He took that as agreement. The next morning, when word got around the repair bay that Roan had spent a credit on a pocket Drake runt, the reaction was exactly what he expected. His coworkers laughed. The senior engineer told him he had wasted his money on a paperweight. One of the older dockworkers said pocket Drakes were only useful when they were full-sized, and a runt that small would never grow enough to be worth anything. Roan listened to all of this and said nothing. Pip sat in his collar the whole time, warm and still, with her chin resting on his shoulder, watching each person who spoke with those calm amber eyes. She did not look like something useless. She looked like something that was paying very close attention. 3 weeks after Pip arrived, Roan found his only good wrench under his cot, buried beneath a pile of things he had never put there. There was a square of foil from a ration wrapper, flattened very carefully. There were 2 small bolts, his bolts, from his toolbox, which he had been looking for since Tuesday. There was a broken lens ring from a headlamp, a cracked piece of something that had once been a circuit board but now showed a faint shimmer on its surface when the light hit it right, and at the very center of the pile, sitting on top of everything else like it was the most important thing there, was a small round pebble. Smooth, pale gray, with a single vein of white running through the middle like a thread. Roan picked up the pebble. He had no idea where it had come from. He looked at Pip. Pip was sitting on the edge of the shelf, watching him with her ears raised and her tail curled neat around her feet. She looked extremely calm for a creature who had just been discovered hoarding his tools. "These are my bolts," he said. Her tail curled a little tighter, that was all. He put the bolts back in his toolbox and left the rest of the pile alone. He was not sure why. Something about the way it was arranged, careful, deliberate, each piece placed rather than dropped, made him feel like he would be doing something wrong by moving it. He mentioned it to Davin the next day. Davin worked the cargo docks at the far end of the station, a young alien with 4 arms and a habit of laughing at things before he fully understood them, then going quiet when he did. He was the closest thing Roan had to a real friend on Caldera, mostly because they had both arrived as outsiders, and neither of them had anywhere better to be on rest days. "Pocket Drake hoard," Davin said, not laughing this time. He looked at Roan over his lunch. "It's what they do. In the wild they gather things. Shiny things, interesting things, things that catch light. Build a pile, offer it." "Offer it to who?" "Their bonded partner." Davin picked at his food. "It's how they say, 'I see you, I chose you, this is mine and I'm giving it to you.'" Roan was quiet for a moment. "She took my bolts." "She gave you her bolts," Davin said. "There's a difference." Roan thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. He thought about it while he was crawling through the undercarriage of a cargo hauler, tightening a fuel seal that should have been replaced 2 years ago. He thought about it while he ate dinner alone in the corridor outside his bunk, because the communal room was too loud. He thought about it when he got back and found Pip immediately climbing onto his shoulder and pressing the top of her small head against the side of his jaw, which she did most evenings now, and which he had come to expect in a way that surprised him. He was not a person who had been given things very often. His father had been a good man but a quiet one, more comfortable with machines than words. After he died, there had been the debt and the station and the work and not much else. Roan had gotten used to that. He had told himself he did not mind it. Pip complicated that story somewhat. She was, against all expectations, genuinely useful. Not in the ways anyone had predicted. She was still too small to carry anything heavy, too light to be much physical help, but in other ways that turned out to matter more. She could fit into spaces no human hand or tool could reach. A jammed bearing in a tight engine housing that would have taken 2 hours of disassembly to reach took 4 minutes with Pip guiding him by sound. A specific pattern of low chirps that he had learned meant warmer, colder there, stop. She could feel vibrations in metal that instruments missed. 3 times in 1 week, she had tapped at a hull panel that later turned out to have a micro-fracture developing underneath. The senior engineer stopped laughing by the end of the second week. By the third, he had started leaving Roan the more complicated jobs. But the hoarding got worse. Not worse in a bad way, nothing important went missing. She never took anything that caused real trouble, but bigger, more focused. She had moved the pile from under the cot to the back corner of the shelf, and she had started adding to it every few days. A button-sized disc of reflective alloy she had found somewhere near the recycling bay. A chip of something pale and crystalline, almost transparent. A strip of copper wire no longer than her tail, coiled into a loose ring. What was strange was that she stopped letting Roan handle the pieces. She had been comfortable with him picking up and looking at items from the pile before. Now if he reached toward the shelf, she would step between him and it, not aggressively, not in a way that felt like a warning, more like a child covering a drawing with both hands before it was finished. Roan did not push it. He trusted her in the way you trust something that has never given you a reason not to. What he did not know yet, what he had no way of knowing, was that 2 days ago, he had mentioned to Davin, in passing, the way people do when something is not important enough to make a big deal of, that his birthday was in 12 days. He had said it because Davin had asked why he was doing overtime all week, and the honest answer was that he wanted to get ahead on the guild debt before he turned 20, because turning 20 with the same debt felt worse somehow than turning 19 with it. He had said it quietly, the way he said most things. But Pip had been sitting in his collar when he said it, and Pip heard everything. And Pip had gone back to the shelf that evening and looked at the pile for a long time, the way someone looks at something when they are trying to figure out if it is enough, or if they need more. It was not enough yet. She needed more. On the 4th level of Caldera Station, past the fuel exchange offices and the courier desks and a long gray corridor that always smelled like something metallic and faintly sweet, there was a small market that most people did not bother with. It was not the main bazaar. It had no food stalls, no second-hand equipment, nothing practical. It sold minerals. Chunks of raw asteroid ore, polished geode slices, crystalline formations pulled from mining runs and sold to collectors and decorators and the occasional scientist. The stall owners were patient and unhurried, used to long, quiet stretches between customers. Most of what they sold was expensive. Most of what they sold sat for weeks before anyone bought it. The oldest seller in the mineral market was a Silthiri named Voss. Silthiri were tall, slow-moving beings with pale skin that had gone almost translucent with age, so that in certain lights you could see the faint outlines of the structures beneath. They lived a very long time. Voss himself was somewhere past his 400th year and had stopped counting with any precision, and they had a reputation for patience that other species sometimes mistook for disinterest. Voss was not disinterested. He noticed everything. He had simply learned that most things did not require an immediate reaction. He noticed the small creature on the 7th day. It came along the ventilation shelf that ran above his stall, a narrow ledge meant to carry air ducts, not foot traffic, but apparently navigable if you were the size of a large insect and had claws designed for gripping. It moved carefully, stopping every few body lengths to look down at the display cases below. It was a pocket drake. Voss had seen them before, decades ago on a different station, though never one quite so small. This one had scales that caught the light in a way that reminded him of the iridescent ore samples in his third case, blue-green copper, shifting as it moved. He watched it without moving. It was studying his display. Not randomly, it passed over the large chunks of raw ore entirely, ignored the geode slices, spent almost no time on the rough, unpolished specimens. It stopped at the smooth things, the things that caught light cleanly. A row of small polished spheres, each one a different mineral, lined up in order of color. A flat piece of labradorite, gray on one side and exploding into blue-green fire when the light hit it at the right angle. A cluster of tiny rose quartz points, pale pink and semi-transparent, the kind of thing that was cheap to buy and pleasant to look at. The pocket drake reached down from the shelf with one small forefoot and hooked the smallest rose quartz point, barely the size of Voss's thumbnail, and began to drag it back up toward the ledge. Voss watched. He could have said something. He could have reached over and taken the piece back. It was worth almost nothing, a fraction of a credit, the kind of thing he threw in free with larger purchases. That was not why he stayed still. He stayed still because of the way the creature was moving. It was not playing. It was not being careless or impulsive the way small animals sometimes were with shiny objects. It was careful, very careful, the way you are careful with something that matters, something you are responsible for. It had the quartz piece secured against its chest with both front feet, and it was moving slowly, deliberately, making sure it did not drop it. And then Voss saw where it was going. Behind his stall, in the narrow space between the back wall and the mineral cases, Pip had a spot. Voss had not known about it until this moment. It was a shallow hollow in the wall where an old cable bracket had been removed years ago, leaving a gap just wide enough for something very small. Inside the gap, barely visible, was a collection of objects, a few small bolts, a disc of reflective alloy, a strip of copper wire, a chip of pale crystalline material. And she was arranging them. Not piling, arranging. Moving pieces, adjusting positions, trying the copper wire in one configuration and then another. The bolts were placed at intervals. The crystal chip was positioned where the light from the overhead strip caught it best. Voss looked at the shape of what was being built. It was not finished. It was not even close. But he was 400 years old and he had seen many things and he understood what he was looking at. It was a circle, or it was trying to be. A ring of gathered objects sized. He tilted his head and looked more carefully. Yes, sized for a human head. He sat with that for a while. In 400 years, Voss had sold minerals to hundreds of species. He had seen creatures hoard. He had seen creatures nest, build, collect, defend. He had never, not once in 4 centuries, seen a bonded creature attempt to construct something. Not gather, not pile, construct, with intention, with shape, toward a purpose that existed outside itself. He looked at the rose quartz piece, now being carefully fitted against the copper wire. Then he reached into his display case and selected a second piece of rose quartz, slightly larger, a better color, the kind with a natural translucency that made it glow faintly when light came through it. He set it on the edge of the shelf, close to where Pip was working, and moved his hand away. He picked up the data pad he used for inventory and looked at it without reading anything on it. A few minutes later, without any sound, the second piece of quartz disappeared from the shelf. Voss put the data pad down. He looked at the gap in the wall where the crown was slowly, piece by piece, becoming real. He thought about the concept of a birthday, something he had learned about from humans over the years, a custom that had always puzzled him slightly. The idea that you celebrated the day a person had been born, not what they had done, not what they had become, simply that they existed and had kept existing, and that this was worth marking with something made by hand. He had always found it a little strange. He was finding it considerably less strange now. The freighter came in wrong. Every dockworker on Caldera Station heard the sound before they saw anything, a low, uneven throb in the arrival signal that meant something on the ship was not cycling correctly. By the time the freighter actually appeared on the approach display, its engine readout was already flashing 3 amber warnings and 1 red. It limped through the outer docking gate at half its normal approach speed, leaking drive exhaust from a seal that had probably been failing for days, and came to a stop at the emergency berth with a shudder that rattled the floor plates. All available mechanics were called to the bay inside 4 minutes. Roan had been in his bunk when the alert came through. He had been sitting on the edge of the cot, not quite asleep, staring at nothing in the way he sometimes did when the day had been long, and his brain had not yet agreed to stop. He had his jacket on before the second alert finished sounding. He almost let Pip come with him. She was already on his shoulder, already awake. She woke when he woke, somehow, always with her wings half raised and her amber eyes bright in the low light. He had his hand up to move her to his collar when he thought about the repair bay. Open fuel lines, plasma cutters, hull panels being shifted with heavy equipment, people moving fast in a small space with no margin for error. "Not tonight," he said. "Stay." Pip looked at him. He could feel the small tension in her body, not resistance exactly, more like argument. "I'll be back," he said. "Stay here, please." She stepped off his shoulder onto the shelf and sat down. She did not look happy about it. He left before she could change either of their minds. The repair took the whole night. The failed seal was deep in the engine housing, which meant the outer panel had to come off first, then the secondary casing, then the heat shield, and by the time they actually reached the seal itself, there were 6 mechanics crammed into a space built for 2, working by handheld light because the overhead system could not be activated near an open fuel line. It was hot, it was cramped, and the seal had failed in the specific way that made replacement slow. Not a clean break but a gradual collapse. Material degraded across the whole ring, which meant the surrounding components had to be inspected and logged before anything could be signed off. Roan was on his knees inside the housing for 4 hours straight. His back hurt. His hands were black with residue. At some point, someone passed a ration bar down the line and he ate it without tasting it, wedged between a fuel coupling and the inner hull, using a light clamp to his shoulder because he needed both hands. He did not think about his birthday. It had not occurred to him all week, not really, not in a way that felt important. Tomorrow he would be 20. He had not told anyone except Davin, and he had told Davin by accident, and he expected nothing from it. Birthdays were something that happened to people who had family nearby or friends who made plans. He had work and a guild debt and a small dragon he was becoming increasingly attached to, and that was a fine enough life. He crawled out of the engine housing at about the 3rd hour of the station's night cycle, when the repair was finally complete and certified, and stood up slowly with both hands pressed to his lower back. The repair bay was quieter now. Most of the team had gone. The freighter sat in its berth, still and dark, its engine readout showing all green for the first time since it arrived. He walked back to Corridor 7 alone. He had forgotten that Pip had been up when he left. He had forgotten that he had told her to stay. He had forgotten, in the long, exhausted blur of the last several hours, almost everything except the floor in front of his feet and the direction of his bunk. So he did not think anything of it when he pushed open the door and found the room dark. He did not look at the shelf. He sat down on the cot, pulled off his boots, lay down on top of the blanket because he did not have the energy to get under it, and was asleep in about 40 seconds. He did not see Pip in the corner of the room, working by the thin strip of light that came under the door. Davin had come by 2 hours earlier. He had not planned to. He had been passing the corridor on his way back from a late shift and remembered, in the way you remember something that has been sitting at the back of your mind for a few days, that tomorrow was Roan's birthday, and that Roan had said it like it did not matter. Davin had his own complicated feelings about that. He had brothers on his home world who sent things for his marking days. Roan had no one. He had knocked quietly, expecting no answer, planning to leave again. The door had opened, because Roan was not there to have locked it properly, and the room was dark except for a faint light from the corner near the shelf. Davin had stood in the doorway for a moment, letting his eyes adjust. Then he had seen Pip. She was on the floor in the corner, which was unusual. She almost always stayed elevated, on the shelf or the cot or Roan's shoulder. Around her was a loose ring of objects that Davin recognized from the times Roan had described the horde. She had the copper wire strip in her mouth and was working it around the outside of the ring, bending it with her teeth and her front claws, trying to get it to hold a circular shape. Davin crouched down. He looked at the ring. He looked at Pip. Pip looked back at him for a long moment. Then she pushed a short length of wire toward him with one foot. He did not fully understand what he was being asked to do, but he understood enough. He sat down cross-legged on the floor of Roan's bunk. A pocket drake the size of his fist on one side, and a half-finished crown of bolts and crystal and rose quartz on the other, and got to work. Pip burned her front paw sometime around the second hour, pressing her flame too close to a join to fuse the copper. She made no sound. She looked at it for a moment, then went back to what she was doing. Davin saw it happen. He said nothing, because she did not stop, and he understood without being told that stopping was not something she was considering. By the time the faint sound of Roan's boots came down the corridor, the crown was on the shelf. Davin was gone. Pip was sitting very still in the center of the room, watching the door. Her front paw was still slightly warm where she had burned it. She did not care about that at all. Roan did not wake up gently. He woke up the way he always did after a long repair shift, all at once, with his body already half sitting before his brain had caught up, instinctively checking the sound of the station around him for anything that needed to be fixed. The hum of the air system was normal. The distant low pulse of the docking mechanisms was normal. No alarms, no alerts. He sat on the edge of his cot in the same clothes he had fallen asleep in, smelling like burnt fuel and metal, and pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes for a moment. Then he felt the familiar weight settle onto his knee. He lowered his hands. Pip was sitting on his knee looking at him. She did this sometimes in the mornings, climbed up while he was still half asleep and waited for him to notice her. But there was something different about this morning. She was not doing the usual thing, which was to chirp at him until he got up and found her something to eat. She was still, completely still. Her tail was wrapped around her feet, her wings were flat, and her amber eyes were fixed on his face with an expression he could not quite name, serious maybe, careful, like she was waiting for something specific. Between her front feet was an object. He looked at it. It was a ring, a rough circle of copper wire, thin and slightly uneven, with small objects fixed along it at intervals. He could see the bolts he had put back in his toolbox weeks ago, each one placed deliberately, evenly spaced. He could see the crystal chip from her hoard, the one that caught light and split it into color. He could see the two pieces of rose quartz, pale and glowing faintly in the bunk's low morning light, one slightly larger than the other, both nestled against the wire with their points facing inward. There was the reflective disc, and the fragment of navigation glass he had not even known she had found, which threw a soft shimmer of prismatic light across the wall when the overhead strip caught it. The whole thing was perhaps the width of his head, maybe a little wider. It was crooked. One side sat slightly higher than the other. The wire was not perfectly circular. It had a flat section near the back where it had been harder to bend. One of the bolts was at a slightly different angle from the others. A small scorch mark on the copper, near one of the quartz pieces, showed where something very hot had been applied very precisely. Roan looked at it for a long time without speaking. Pip had not moved. She was still watching his face. He reached out and picked it up very slowly. The way you pick up something you already know is important. It was lighter than he expected. The wire flexed a little in his hands. The glass fragment caught the light and threw a thin rainbow across his knuckles. He turned it over once, then he put it on his head. It sat there, slightly lopsided, a little loose, not by any measurement a perfect thing. A tiny scavenged crown made of stolen bolts and mineral chips and copper wire fused together by something smaller than his fist. Pip sat up straight. She was very small. She was the smallest pocket drake anyone on Caldera Station had ever seen, and she would probably never get much bigger, and there had been a long list of people who had told Roan she was useless. She was decorative at best. she was a waste of a credit. She sat up with her wings half raised and her chest out and her chin lifted, and she made a sound quiet low from somewhere deep in her small body. Not a chirp, not a whistle. A sound with weight to it, something that resonated in the room like a note held for a long time. Davin told him later what that sound meant. He had looked it up after the night before, wanting to understand. It was the pocket Drake sound for mine, safe, loved. Roan did not know that yet in the moment. He just knew the sound. He knew the crown on his head. He knew the way Pip was looking at him, like she had done something she had been working toward for a very long time, and it had come out the way she meant it to, and she was glad. He was 20 years old. He was sitting in a narrow bunk in Corridor 7, wearing engine oil and a crown made of junk, with 3 credits to his name and a guild debt and no family within any reasonable distance. He cried. He was not embarrassed about it. The tears came quietly, the way things come when you have been keeping them back for a while without quite realizing it, and he sat very still and let them, because moving felt wrong, because the small, warm creature on his knee had spent 12 days gathering pieces of light and fusing them together with her own fire, had burned herself doing it, and had waited up all night to give it to him, and he did not know what to do with that except feel it completely. Pip climbed up his arm and pressed the top of her head against his jaw. She made the sound again, softer. He lifted his hand and held it near her, not quite touching, and she leaned into it. Neither of them heard the door. Neither of them saw Davin and Voss standing in the corridor, looking in through the gap. Davin had brought Voss without fully planning to. They had met in the corridor, and Davin had said, "I think you should see this." And Voss had come because 400 years of life had taught him to pay attention when someone said that in a certain tone. Voss stood in the doorway of a small, badly lit bunk room on a frontier station he had been working from for 30 years, and he watched a young human sit on a cot in engine oil, with a crooked crown of scavenged stones on his head, and a tiny dragon pressed against his face, and he felt something move in him that he did not have a word for in his own language. He turned away after a moment. He told Davin, very quietly, that in 400 years he had bought and sold gems from 20 star systems, rare ores, mineral formations worth more than some ships. He had held things that entire institutions wanted to own. He had never, he said, been in the presence of anything that valuable. Davin said nothing. He was also crying and at least had the grace to admit it. 6 months passed the way time passes when things are mostly good quickly and without enough notice. Roan paid off the guild debt in the 4th month. It happened faster than he expected because the senior engineer had put him on the specialist repair roster, which paid better, and because he had gotten better at the work. Not just technically better, though that too, but better in the way that happens when you stop spending energy on being alone and have somewhere to direct it instead. He fixed things more efficiently. He asked better questions. He stayed later when the job needed it, not out of desperation, but out of something closer to actual investment. Pip was with him for most of it. She had become a fixture in the repair bay in the way that things become fixtures when they are consistently useful and not particularly inconvenient. People stopped noticing she was unusual and started noticing her specifically. The younger mechanics learned her sound system before they learned some of the equipment procedures. A first-year apprentice named Yola had cried, very quietly, on her 3rd week of work when Pip had climbed onto her shoulder for the first time, apparently having made some private judgment that this person was acceptable. Yola told Roan it was the best thing that had happened to her since she arrived. The crown lived on a hook above Roan's bunk. He had put it there carefully on the morning of his birthday and had not moved it since. The wire had been straightened slightly. He had bent it back into a rounder shape one evening very gently, using the same care he used on delicate components, but he had not changed anything else. The bolts were where Pip had put them. The quartz was where she had fixed it. The scorch marks were still there. He wore it twice. Once on his birthday, for the rest of that day, while people in the corridor looked at him sideways and he did not explain. Once 3 months later, when Davin's marking day came and Roan made a small event of it in the communal room, and Davin had looked at the crown on his head and laughed until he had to sit down. The story spread the way stories spread on stations, person by person, with each telling adding some small detail the teller happened to find important. Voss told it most often in his quiet, unhurried way to the traders who came through the mineral market. He told it without drama, just as a thing that had happened, and somehow that made it land harder than if he had made it impressive. Several merchants started leaving small polished stones near the back of his stall, in the gap where Pip had built the crown. Voss did not remove them. He was not sure why, except that it felt like it would be wrong to. The researcher arrived in the 5th month. Her name was Dr. Soli. She was a Varindi, a species Roan had only vaguely heard of, tall and angular with a natural stillness that made her seem like she was always listening to something slightly outside the range of normal hearing. She had come specifically because of a message Voss had sent to a colleague of his at the Interstellar Xenobehavioral Archive, a casual note that had turned out to be considerably less casual than he intended. She introduced herself to Roan with a formal politeness that made him feel briefly like he had done something wrong, and then explained that she was not here about him, precisely. She was here about Pip. Roan showed her the crown. He showed her the hook above his bunk, and the shelf where the hoard pile still lived, smaller now, most of it incorporated into the crown, but not empty, and he answered her questions as well as he could, which in some cases was not very well because many of Pip's decisions were not things he had been present for. Soli interviewed Davin. She interviewed Voss at length. She spent 3 hours in the mineral market, and Voss told Roan later that she had gone very quiet partway through and had not spoken for several minutes. She also spent time simply watching Pip, which Pip tolerated with the air of someone who has better things to do, but is willing to be patient about it. The paper Soli filed with the archive 6 weeks later was precise and careful and fairly dry in the way academic papers usually are. It laid out the observable facts, the hoarding behavior, the construction method, the evidence of intentional design, the tool use involving Pip's own fire, the inclusion of items sourced from multiple locations suggesting planned acquisition over time. It noted the injury to Pip's front paw as evidence of cost tolerance in service of the goal. The final paragraph was 3 sentences. It had caused some argument among the 4 colleagues who reviewed the paper before publication, because 2 of them thought it was too much of a claim for the evidence presented, and 2 of them thought it was exactly right. It said, the subject did not act on instinct. She acted on observation. She watched a human celebrate, understood it as a practice of love, replicated the structure, and executed it at personal cost, which suggests not that she learned to love, but that she learned how humans love, and decided that was the right way to do it. Roan read the paper on his data pad. Sitting in the communal room with Pip asleep on his shoulder, he read it twice. Then he put the pad down and looked at the ceiling for a while. What struck him, the thing he turned over in his head that day and many days after, was the idea that Pip had watched him watching other people be celebrated, that she had noticed the look on his face, that she had understood something he had not said aloud, had possibly not even fully understood himself, which was that he had been quietly and without much complaint going without something that mattered. And she had decided to fix it, not because she was told to, not because anything in her biology required it, because she had looked at him and seen something that should not be missing, and she had gathered up everything she could carry and made it herself with her own teeth and her own flame, imperfect and crooked and completely, entirely on purpose. Roan looked at Pip. Pip cracked one amber eye open. She already knew, he said, to no one in particular, to the room, to whatever part of the universe was listening. Pip closed her eye again. Her tail curled a little tighter around his collar. Outside, the station went on the way stations do, loud and crowded and full of beings who passed each other daily without much thought. Ships came and went. Mechanics fixed things and broke other things and fixed them again. Somewhere on level 4, an old mineral trader told the story of a small dragon and a birthday crown to a merchant who had not heard it, in the same quiet way he always did, and the merchant sat still for a moment afterward and did not say anything. In a narrow bunk in Corridor 7, above a hook that held a crooked crown of copper wire and rose quartz and stolen bolts, a young human sat with a small dragon on his shoulder, and both of them were, in their different ways, completely at home. That was all, that was enough. That was the thing the galaxy kept finding so hard to fully explain, and so impossible to stop thinking about once it had seen it. The way humans made home out of almost nothing, the way they reached toward each other across every kind of distance, the way they marked each other's existence with handmade things and called it love. It was not power, it was not size, it was not the strength of their bodies or the reach of their ships. It was this. It was always this.